Welcome to the Build a Mind podcast. I'm Joel Thomas.
And I'm Kalen Folk.
Hey, we actually nailed that. It feels good to be back for another excellent episode here. We have a really cool guest, and we're going to introduce him very, very shortly. But first order of business, I got a couple of quick announcements that I'm going to go over. We have the NAPE conference coming up in Houston. That's February 18th through 20th. So please come stop by at our booth, which is going to be the Bitcoin Mining World booth, and say hi. Kalen, are you planning on being there? I unfortunately will not, but I know the rest of our team is.
Yeah, I'll be there front and center. Any questions for any of the people in the natural gas industry looking to get into Bitcoin mining, we're your guys. So we'll be happy to mingle and share the knowledge.
Well, we are super excited about that. It's always fun to see people and come hang out with them. So a couple more things here I want to go over very quickly before we get started is we have some awesome groups on Telegram. So if you are interested in learning more about Bitcoin mining, please join our Telegram groups. We have groups covering everything that you can possibly ever want to know. So hit us up on Telegram. We're scanning the QR codes right below and join us. And next, we're just going to do a quick word from the sponsors of this podcast here this week. So first up is going to be mininginvestmentsim.com. So before you go buy miners or sign a hosting deal, run your numbers at mininginvestmentsim.com. It's a mining investment simulator that helps you see how sensitive your outcome is to assumptions like power, uptime, and network conditions. That's mininginvestmentsim.com. And our second and last sponsor is powerprofitbtc.com. So if you control excess or stranded energy and you're wondering if Bitcoin mining actually fits, go run the tools at powerprofitbtc.com. It's going to help you sanity check economics and feasibility before you spend some real hard-earned money. That's powerprofitbtc.com. All right, all that fun stuff out of the way here today on the Build a Mind podcast. We're joined by Dr. Murray Rudd. And Dr. Rudd is an environmental economist who took a deep dive into Bitcoin and never looked back. He's one of the only researchers in the world studying Bitcoin mining from a scientific, data-driven perspective, and has also served as a science advisor for Satoshi Action, helping policymakers understand what miners actually do. Dr. Rudd's work connects energy, economics, and mining in a way that cuts through the noise. So we are super excited to pick his brain from the perspective of real-world operators. Dr. Rudd, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
It's a real pleasure, and you got a really nice-looking setup there.
Oh,
Yes,
thanks.
sir.
Yeah, I just got that set up about a month and a half ago now, so just settling in.
Excellent.
Yeah,
So give us a little bit about your background, because I've seen you on a couple other Bitcoin podcasts because I'm a total junkie with that stuff. So I'm vaguely familiar. Like I really like the one you did with Robin Sayre. So tell us a little bit about who you are and where you come from.
Yeah, well, I had a very convoluted journey into Bitcoin. I used to be in academia, so I'm an economist by training. And specializing in environmental economics. So when I decided to leave academia back in 2019, I moved back to Canada. I was abroad for a while and ended up sort of picking up. I was aware of Bitcoin like for quite a while, all the way back to 2010. It was one of these things like 3 touches before you actually get it. And I spent a bit of time. I spent my year or so dabbling in altcoins, and then moved all Bitcoin after I guess it was the last market peak. I ended up selling right at the peak and then buying back a little bit during the bear market. So I became interested in Bitcoin a lot because of the environmental implications. And I had been working in the UK for a while, and there was this Buddhist monastery that was just down from my area in York. And we really discussed like putting in Bitcoin miners into the new development that they had down there. They had wood-fired generation, they had solar panels, and they were getting basically crap rates selling electricity back to the grid over there. So that sort of got me interested in the mining side and digging into it. And on the academic side, I think the other thing that really influenced me was that one of my areas is horizon scanning, which we can probably talk a bit about. But back in about 2017, 2018, Bitcoin mining got picked up as a potential positive in the academic literature because of its potential to basically sop up extra methane. And that was something that was interesting. And then, of course, the whole academic sort of narrative went sideways for a while. And I ended up being the contrarian in the crowd.
That was my first question that I had for you, really, was what was your preconceived notion coming from an environmentalist background? Typically, most environmentalists, as soon as they hear Bitcoin mining, they're screaming murder. It's pulling a crazy amount of electricity. But like you're saying, what a lot of people don't know is they're using a lot of stranded energy that's already being generated. But then and if it's not used, it's just getting put on the customer's bill that aren't using it all. So what was your thoughts on it beforehand?
Yeah, I guess like when I first heard about it, I knew it used a lot of energy, even going way back. And I was that didn't bother me too much from the environmental perspective because there's so many things that really you factor into how energy is used and what the impacts are ultimately. So I certainly didn't believe, on first read, some of the people like Digiconomist, like Alex DeVries, and some of the papers that he did, they were put out in like fairly high profile journals, but there were some like really, really awful assumptions that he was making. And so that didn't really make much sense to me. And
Could you elaborate on that? Like what would be, just for context for everybody so they understand?
Yeah, there's a lot that goes on in the academic space where they make assumptions about, say, for mining, that there's no change in consumer demand over time. So, you take a year's worth of demand and you basically divvy it up by 365 days and average things out. And so that misses all the dynamics of what happens, especially in the US with variable power rates going up and down. And so it just entirely misses the entire dynamic portion of what happens in Bitcoin mining. And of course, it also totally ignored, and sometimes I think deliberately actually, but it ignored the potential impacts on renewables and renewable build out and the whole arguments about increasing the profitability of renewables and having a customer where they can sell wind energy at night when there's really no demand for electricity. So a lot of this stuff also factored in. I'm a microeconomist by training, so I do a lot of work with supply and demand historically. And so I won't do any of that in this particular podcast, but like I am always like I have my hands up saying this is demand and this is supply. And so I really like to think in terms of what happens to supply and demand. And for Bitcoin, it's a really interesting thing because you have to consider Bitcoin, but you also have to consider the grid.
For sure.
Very, very interesting. So, if you had to explain to like the layman, right? So for example, you were at a dinner party and anybody who's passionate about Bitcoin has gone through this experience, or, we just had the holidays. So maybe you're sitting around for like New Year's or Christmas or, whatever you celebrate. And, you're like your aunt comes over and be like, oh, what's new? And, you just start going off about Bitcoin and, monetary inflation and all these different wild things that we do. So how would you, one narrative that people say, well, isn't that like bad for the environment? You kind of get that argument. What would you say to that person at that dinner in a way that you just totally destroy their argument?
Yeah, I think that the things I focus on are one, that it monetizes energy in places that energy can't be monetized normally. And so that's good for local communities. It's good for the potentially good for the environment, depending how it's done. And it's certainly good for electricity grids. So to be able to talk about Bitcoin being so super responsive that it can be throttled back and forth and up and down. And if there's a winter storm like there was down in Texas, like occasionally over the past few years, everybody can throttle off their power use, but then they are able to use that extra power that goes to waste most of the time. So whether it's a nuclear plant that has like a base load that's, you're always going for peak pricing. So I don't go into that much detail if I'm at a Christmas dinner, but that's the sort of thing that I try to emphasize, is that no, you actually got to think about what's going on with the overall picture. And I have I know a lot of people that are in the Bitcoin mining space are really skeptical about climate change. And I'm not from the science perspective, but I also believe that there's very different policy solutions and different types of solutions that we can do that are, there's sort of an alignment between Bitcoin mining and methane mitigation in particular, and that it can be good for both financial reasons, for environmental reasons, and also it's a very big thing potentially for local community well-being. And maybe we'll talk a bit about that later on with the methane from landfill gas. But there's another piece in there as well.
I mean, we can definitely dive into that because it's very fascinating. It's like, things I've heard people talk about. So how exactly does that work? What does that look like? What's the role of Bitcoin mining in terms of how it helps solve that problem?
Yeah, well, you mean the sort of the big picture mitigation for climate change?
Yeah, for like methane.
For methane, methane's really interesting because it's produced in so many different ways, and so there's a natural component, and then there's a anthropogenic or a human-made component of it. But the human side comes from agriculture, it comes from food processing, it comes from waste disposal, it comes from oil and gas emissions, and so there's all the old coal mines as well. So there's all these different parts for methane that emit methane into the atmosphere. And methane's super potent. It's about, depending on the time frame you look at, it's about 30 times more potent than actual carbon dioxide. So if you can take methane and turn it into carbon dioxide, you've made a huge gain. And it's something that can be done really fast. And Bitcoin mining's role in it would be, in particular, where methane isn't being destroyed right now. It's not being, used for other electricity generation or even for flaring. If you get this vented methane that's going into the atmosphere, it's a huge, huge plus to be able to capture it and burn it. And if you can burn it and recover your costs at the same time, that's sort of the holy grail within the climate change mitigation. The people that think about that, it's how do you actually come up with a tool that's scalable, that's fairly portable, that is able to have an impact on at locations that are off the grid and quite remote. And think of abandoned oil wells that might be leaking methane, or an old coal mine, things like that. So there's a lot of different pluses to it, and it hasn't really been taken that seriously internationally yet, but there are some exceptions, and particularly Crusoe Energy, before they got bought out, they had got some real high profile sort of clips and highlights in some of the international organization documents. So it wasn't UN documents, but it was sort of up at that level. And so methane mitigation started to get a little bit of a profile at that time.
Can you dive in a little bit more onto some of these other capture methods, on how these people are capturing the methane, and maybe some examples of how it's actually being used to facilitate energy production for Bitcoin miners specifically?
Yeah. Well, you can sort of think, say, for instance, you have a landfill. You have a lot of landfills, even in the US right now, that are still just venting methane into the atmosphere. And at least in the prior administration, there was a lot of emphasis on trying to get that a little bit more under control. Then you have other facilities that are either mandated to go through and flare the gas. So the flaring the gas is destroying the methane and turning it into carbon dioxide. So you get the gains there, but you don't have any cost recovery with that. And then your other option for landfill is you have to go through the landfill gas. It contains a portion of methane, and it sort of depends on the age of the landfill and the level of organics in it. There's all sorts of technical things and models that you can use. But basically what you can do is you can go in and do a cleaning process on the landfill gas, which turns the you can go to then methane that can be burned in generators to power the electricity, to provide electricity for Bitcoin miners or for other uses. It doesn't have to be, it could be data centers, it could be something else as well. And then if you go through another step for purification, you can actually sell the natural gas. So a lot of facilities sell natural gas. So the question with sort of becomes after a while, well, to sell natural gas, usually you have to be on a pipeline system and into some sort of collection system where you can readily get it into a market. And then the thing that has always sort of bothered me with natural gas production is that ultimately you ship it, usually like it will be exported, or it could be used in the petrochemical industry domestically, sort of depending where you are. And but that eventually gets burned again. And so then the methane goes back and you're back with a potential emissions problem wherever the final use is. So it's a really complicated system. And throwing mining into the mix gives you a lot more optionality, and it helps to recover costs. It might not be fully profitable, say for like a landfill site. It might be, it might not be. Sort of like that's one of the things our paper looked at. But the thing is that, you know, at absolute worst, if you're a municipality somewhere that has a landfill that's been mandated that you have to clean the thing up, well, then you can go in and you might not be able to completely cover your costs, but all the costs that you do recover, that all in theory is offsetting the amount of taxes that have to be paid locally. So even if it's not profitable from a traditional commercial perspective, it still could be a really good thing.
So this was something that we were actually kind of looking into at the last mine that I was working at. We were located about 2.5 miles away from kind of the landfill of the area. I'm from the Midwest, from a smaller rural area in general, but we looked into doing about 0.5 megawatt and started talking to them. And you were discussing on how it's not as profitable for the landmine itself to start these initiatives, but from our perspective, working out some sort of deal, these landfills are just, they're letting it go naturally already into the atmosphere. So our idea was to just kind of come in with all of the equipment, cut them a bit of the piece of the pie. Have you seen any operations like that? We never ended up going through with it, just because we ended up closing down shortly after investigating it. But it was something we were considering.
Yeah, and that paper that we did, so we have a methane mitigation or a methane landfill paper that was published in a journal
Sorry to
called.
cut you off real quick, but all of these papers that are being mentioned, they are all going to be linked in the description for anybody interested in looking at them. Just hit the description and they'll be right there.
That's good. Good to have as a resource. So this Journal of Cleaner Production, that's where our methane or our landfill paper got published, and that's we had it. You know, most people are thinking of academics, and you're thinking like my sister says, "Oh, a bunch of eggheads," you know, going out and like doing things that are completely out of touch with reality, and I've always thought it's really important to work with people from industry, so you sort of get the technical details right. And so if you look in that paper, 2 of our co-authors were from Nodal Energy. So they have an operating landfill site down in Utah, about 1 megawatt, no, 1.4, 1.6, sort of somewhere in that area. And then they have another site down in New Mexico as well. So they were able, like in their experience there, I think I believe the Utah site was one that had already been capped. So your first step in a methane is to go and basically tarp it up, and so you don't have any gas emitting to the atmosphere. And then you capture all the landfill gas, then you go through the cleanup process. So I think with Nodal, if I recall properly, they had went into a site that was tarped, or that was capped, whatever the technical term is for it. But then they were still venting methane. So they did somewhat like you were just talking about. It was like some kind of agreement where they went in and they provided the capital investment for both the generators and for the miners. And they went in, they provided the expertise, they did it, and then the landfill got a percentage of, I believe it was gross income. And it was a little while ago since I've looked at that, but the landfill definitely got a portion of income back. And as my understanding was, and this was from the nodal co-authors, was that you're looking somewhere between 5% to 30% for the landfill operators, sort of depending on how rich a site it was and what was already there or wasn't there.
Yeah, that's one of the other benefits with it too, is like using renewables and stuff like it. It's ideal for something like a landfill that's just full of trash, is you can
Yeah.
get rid of some of this e-waste. I mean, you can plug in an S9 to renewables and it's going to be profitable. I mean, you're
Yeah.
not paying anything directly for the energy, so you can get rid of a lot of this e-waste that's around there as well. Just kind of a win for win.
Yeah, well, we also, one of the other things in this paper that we did was we tried to figure out what the cost would be for producing methane, or for producing electricity at a landfill site. And by the time you get your capital costs, which 2.5 million per megawatt sort of rings a bell in my head, somewhere in that range. So you have your depreciation. There's not much in the way of direct or variable costs on that, but there are some costs associated. So, we looked in, and when we write an academic paper, one of the things you have to do is you have to try to document your evidence, ideally from other academic journal articles. Like, you just don't usually go out and use blogs or somebody's, Twitter comments or anything like that. It has to be something that has some credibility for the academic editors and reviewers.
What,
So
you mean
we
Twitter
looked at,
as an academic reason? Like Twitter comments?
no. As much as the whole Bitcoin Twitter crowd would love to see that, that's just not the case, unfortunately. It's one of the, and sort of this is a bit of a tangent here, but for Satoshi Action, that was one of the reasons that Dennis Porter had always really thought that having somebody with an academic background associated on staff for the organization was good, and why we tried to, we've pushed a lot of papers out that are just working papers. They actually haven't been published in an academic journal, but we've tried to publish as much as we can. And that, for the policymakers and for some of the state and government employees, that really ups the credibility. And it's one of the reasons that we've done this.
That actually brings up kind of a good question. So I met some of the Satoshi Action guys at Mining Disrupt here. Well, I guess technically that would be last year now. It is the very beginning of January. So so not too long ago, but it doesn't feel like last year. As they were pretty interesting. So how can the Bitcoin industry engage policymakers constructively when they debate, when they're discussing things like Bitcoin mining? Because obviously, there's it seems like a lot of progress has happened for Bitcoin in terms of at least US policy in the last year. So yeah, it seems like quite the challenge, because you want to obviously get as many politicians on board and help them understand this. Like, what are some of the challenges there? What's the progress? What does it look like?
Yeah, I can't really speak for Satoshi Action right now, but and also I wasn't on the policy side, but I worked with quite a bit with Eric Peterson, the former policy director, and of course with Dennis a lot, and yeah, education is just a huge part of it. I mean, Dennis just never stops on the education front. So it's a lot of it's explaining things to politicians and sort of the senior decision makers, but a lot of it also has to do with staffers and coming into the people that actually understand or potentially understand the technical aspects of mining, and really getting them up to speed so they're in a position where they can provide advice or question things that are maybe really sketchy when somebody says it in a meeting. And so there's a lot of things like that happen, and I think that's pretty general. There's always a lot of just debate within academia. All academics want to have policy impact. It's sort of, if you're actually actively working as a professor, it's a little bit, you're actually evaluated on it in most places, what your policy impact is. And one school of thought thinks, well, you need to be doing the bridging out with the senior people And my view on it is definitely much more that the people that really need the education and really need the support are the technical people and in the policy shops, the science advisors, the staffers that are the ones that are actually tasked with helping to develop legislation. So, and then besides the education piece, certainly, like Satoshi Action works a lot with the drafting up the language for policy documents. So there's a lot of model legislation that can be used, and it's basically a template that could be customized for each state. So there's those two big components really that form the bulk of the work.
So from your experience and like, I know you can't speak too much on the policy side, but just from the environmental side, when we're just talking about the United States, because I think that is kind of the central Bitcoin mining hub of the world currently, at least. Maybe I'm wrong on that. But what state do you see as having the best policies around Bitcoin mining for Bitcoin miners? Where should Bitcoin miners go to make the biggest difference?
Yeah, that's a tough one for me to answer because I don't really follow US policy, like state level policy, all that closely, even having worked with Satoshi Action. I mean, I know there's been, I'm Canadian, so that's why.
So in Canada, so where in Canada? Let's go natively. Where are the largest sites located?
Yeah, there's sites in British Columbia, there's sites in Alberta, there's also sites back in Eastern Canada, particularly Quebec, and also sort of inland New Brunswick. And yeah, and everybody, British Columbia has had a lot of British Columbia is quite like West Coast, and in that their attitudes here are very similar to what you would maybe see down in the coastal regions of like Washington, Oregon, California. And so there's been some pushback in government against using electricity from the big hydroelectric developments, specifically for Bitcoin mining. So that's been an ongoing problem. Certainly Iris they have a site up in Canal Flats near the Alberta border, and they have another big site up north of British Columbia. Quebec has been problematic because again, they put all sorts of restrictions on miners using hydroelectric electricity for mining, even though there's a really big surplus up there. And New Brunswick is the same thing. The only place that's really, in my view, that's probably really pro Bitcoin mining right now would be Alberta.
Okay, well, and see that was something I was curious about. So yeah, you're in Canada. Us, Americans, when we're thinking of Canada, we're thinking like the crazy like excess taxes that are being or crazy from our perspective, at least, of all these extra taxes being put in play. I mean, I'm looking at my rate in the Midwest at like 8 cents per kilowatt hour. But what's the average rate in Canada? It's something I should have looked at, but I imagine it's close to 15, 16 cents per kilowatt hour.
Yeah,
is that right?
I don't know if it would be that high. And again, I don't that's not something I really track closely. I think I had lived in Eastern Canada before moving back out to British Columbia, which is like my home. And Eastern Canada, Nova Scotia was quite high. It was like, I think it was around 14 cents or so.
Okay.
And some provinces will be lower than that. I suspect that Quebec, the residential rates are probably quite a bit lower. Alberta is probably fairly low. So, but I don't really, I don't know what the exact numbers are for the different Canadian provinces.
Okay. Yeah. Just from a curious perspective, because like I know you said Twitter is not the end all be all, but coming from the crypto Bitcoin bro aspect, that's where we spend most of our time. So just genuinely curious on how that plays its part.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it would be the same as like in the US. There's a lot of variability, like from state to state, and even within the Midwest, I understand that there's quite a bit of variability. And
it's crazy. Like Wisconsin to Iowa, for example, it's literally double the rate. I mean, just ballpark, or Illinois, it's all over the place.
Yeah. So one of the things, like you'd asked about the states in the U.S., and certainly Oklahoma had come up like a number of times as a good place. When I was with Satoshi Action and we were down at different conferences, and we had talked to some of the senior government officials at that time, and a lot changes. Like there's of course, a lot of politics within within the space. And I know sometimes like the language that goes into the legislation has to be maybe a bit softer than Bitcoin maxis would like to see. But at the same time, there's this need to be able to advance things incrementally through policy. So there's a lot of subtleties in there that I think probably a lot of people don't realize.
Sure.
Is there anything that you think a lot of like regulators and politicians get wrong when it comes to drafting energy policy in terms of like Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining? Sounds like there's a gap between, education, and it's a very serious ongoing effort to help these people understand.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some of the misinformation that has been, well, I don't know if I call it misinformation, but call it like weak academic studies get cited a lot in the policy space. There's also other studies that have been done that have been quite good, but they really don't consider like some of the key variables within that affect the impacts, the local or the national impacts of Bitcoin mining. And an example of that was there was a 2025 paper in Nature Communications, and it was by a group, sort of a multidisciplinary group. But you might remember Gabe Dance, or Gabriel Dance. He was the one that was sort of behind, there was a big Bitcoin hit piece that focused a lot in Riot a couple of years ago. He's an author with the New York Times. And he's actually a co-author on this academic paper. So the academic paper was looking at the public health impacts of Bitcoin mining in the US. And they made a couple of pretty fundamental mistakes in it. And this was published in a super high profile journal. So it gets that carries weight with a lot of decision makers and policymakers and policy shops. But they didn't, these core problems in the analysis a lot of times for any Bitcoin mining operation is that they're assuming that there's constant electricity demand. So they aren't, and how can you, like, if for Bitcoin mining, I mean, you're up and down all over the place, like over the course of a week or a day even. And so they don't consider that. And then they also, the way that they divvy up the allocation, they say, okay, we have a Bitcoin mining in one area, and it draws power from different power plants within the district. And then they just allocate like that power sort of like proportionally through the whole area. So it doesn't, there's other things going on in the electricity market. And so there's all sorts of things that may be moving power prices up and down, maybe impacting, consumer prices or industrial prices. None of that's accounted for. So it averages things out. And there's back in agricultural economics, so that's what I did my undergrad and my master's in. In agricultural economics, there's a pretty famous example, goes back to the 1980s, that with regard to climate change, people were thinking, well, in the US, that climate change was going to cause, like, I don't know, trillions of dollars in damage to the farming industry nationwide. And then you had somebody that went in the mid 80s and came up with this technique that actually started to incorporate this adjustability or this flexibility in farmers. And so think, if you're in a farm, like a wheat farming area, and the temperature goes up, you switch to corn. If it goes up, even if you're in a corn farming area and it gets warmer, you switch to soybean. And so none of the early climate change studies had like even consider any of that. And for farming and for agriculture, which is probably much less sensitive than Bitcoin mining to changing electricity conditions, the numbers were that it was a 50%, the adverse impacts had been overestimated to the agriculture sector by about 50%. Wow. So lots, if it's that much there.
We got a little friend coming by.
Oh, I just saw my little friend.
Surprise guest.
my little friend just completely shredded like some foam on the floor.
Oh no!
I've got like the black snowflakes down on the floor now. Hey.
This is great. This is.
I mean, life happens.
There
even
we
when
go.
you're podcasting.
Big one dog.
I thought he was sleeping, and anyway, yeah.
He just wanted to come say hi, see what's going
Yeah,
on.
yeah. He just wanted to go. See, he gets almost on every podcast, it seems.
He just wants his spot at the shot. The spotlight.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, what's kind of interesting for me, based off what you're saying, is like I'm a marketer. I have a lot of experience marketing and copywriting is persuasion through words, right? Sitting there and getting people to feel a certain emotion when they read something. Or so you think about narratives in the way that like the media could drive a narrative, or you think about research that's being done, and if that research is faulty or they don't model something correctly. And with the wrong narrative, that could actually have a very, very damaging, long-lasting effect if it takes hold. So,
Yeah.
How do you, as a researcher, how do you deal with that? I mean, I think about it as a marketer. Obviously, it's like the media. You just spin it in a different direction and try to redirect people's energy. But from a research point of view.
Yeah, that's a really tough one. And like Simon Collins, who's a Bitcoin miner down in New Zealand, is doing some of that. They have an organization called DARI, DARI, which I forget what that acronym stands for offhand, but he's been trying to sort of counter some of the narratives that go on. Myself, I think that that's pretty futile to try to counter narratives. The only time that I've tried in the Bitcoin space is we know that there's an article that's being considered for publication. In this case, there was an ECB. Sorry, there was an
So what is ECB?
ECB, what European Central Bank? Yeah, that's right. ECB.
Oh, okay.
There was an ECB paper that was being reviewed, and it was just awful. So it was like a number of us got together, and we did a super quick comment on it, and just got it out into the public realm as fast as possible, because we knew that reviewers might be looking around. But once it's through review, then like that's a sort of a done deal. And there's a whole bunch of academic incentives. I don't know if you want to go into this.
Yeah, we absolutely can. I mean, it's important because it affects policy, and it affects, I mean, even for people who are just speculators or, layman miners like myself who want to scale up their operation, like the politics affects the business decisions that you make, because you're sitting there like, where should I deploy my miners? What risks are there? What's my ROI? What's my CapEx? What do I think the politics will go in 5 to 10 years? Is it trending in one direction? And how hostile or pro are those politicians? Those are things you take into consideration when you're making decisions.
Yeah, well, and when you get into the narratives, like what happens is so academics target academic journals. So there's a whole, if you work as a university professor, first of all, there's different levels. So you go from an entry level assistant professor up to a next level associate, and then a full professor eventually. And to make each one of those jumps, you need publications. You need, depending on which university you are, either lots of publications, or you need really high impact publications. So publications that get cited a lot by other researchers and that are published in good journals. So in the journal has a chief editor who really sets the direction of the journal. So if you have a journal editor that hates Bitcoin, and there's a number of them that do, you're never going to get like a pro Bitcoin article published there. And so that's what happened. There's a energy journal called Joule, which is published by Cell Press, and they've published a whole series of these Alex DeVries Digiconomist articles over time. So that's gone out. Alex DeVries, he only had a master's degree when he was doing this. He was working on his PhD, the last I heard. But he got these papers out. Not all of them even went out to review early on. And so they sort of glided through, and that was an editorial choice by the journal. And it's basically a political choice. They were trying to, throw Bitcoin mining, show it in the worst possible light. One would think that academic journals would be maybe neutral and, in search of truth and evidence, but that's not the case at all. It's all it's big money for the publishers. it's career incentives for academics. And what you get is you get this body of work. And once something gets published in a good journal, it makes it all that much easier for the same authors or authors that are sort of friendly in the same, they're sort of the same tribe. And it makes that easy for them to get published. And so you get these narrative like loops that spin up. And that's exactly what happened with the energy issues in Bitcoin. Now, what you're seeing the last couple of years is that those, like the people that were involved prior, the academics that were involved before, maybe have less influence. Like the whole environmental thing has sort of just faded a little bit from the scene over the past year and a half, I'd say. And you're also starting to get like some really high quality research coming out. So you're getting some coming out of Texas. There's a really strong group up at Cornell and in the engineering school that's been cranking out like things about renewable energy and how it can be so like really good for the US. You're also now starting to see papers, not just the one that we did on landfill energy, but also on agricultural systems and biochar and wastewater. So you're starting to get these scattered Bitcoin papers that are coming out and looking at what the potential financial and environmental benefits are. So I think the narrative might be starting to crack, but like looking back over the past 5 years, I mean, it's been really, really abysmal. And like I said at the beginning of the pod, the quality on some of these papers is just awful. Some of it's not too bad. The other thing that factors into that is that when, say, when I submitted my methane paper, and that was along with the nodal people and Dennis Porter and Daniel Batten was a co-author on it as well. So when that got submitted to a journal, it goes in, your first hurdle, you have to get it past the editor. If the editor hates Bitcoin, it's gone, it gets rejected. Then it goes out to reviewers, and then if the reviewers hate Bitcoin or they find a problem with your paper, there might be like both things factoring in, or there can, if we get a reject by the reviewers, then that scuttles the paper as well. So it takes a long time to get papers out, and like industry and policy, well, policy might not move faster, industry certainly does. So it's very difficult for academics to really understand. Like most of the people that publish on Bitcoin don't understand it. They really don't have a handle on it, and which is one of the reasons I advocate that, like, whenever possible, it would be absolutely awesome to have like real Bitcoin miners participating in the research process, just because it brings that degree of realism to the outputs.
So here's a question then. How can miners help generate better academic evidence about the industry's impacts? Like, what opportunities are there for us as miners to collude with academics to set the record straight?
I think that one of the things in the U.S. has been a variety of research programs, collaborative industry university research programs of different sorts in the past, and I'm not sure what the funding situation right now is for research in the U.S. But to look at industrial partnerships and to be willing to participate in those and to provide information. I know miners don't want to provide things that are really confidential, but there's times that they could provide general information that would be very useful. There's probably a role for industry associations, industry data collection. There's, working with groups or organizations that might be verifying the credibility of like basic mining data. Like I just saw on X this afternoon that somebody had posted, it was like 56% renewable energy in Bitcoin mining right now. And understanding what goes on in Bitcoin, I'm really skeptical of that. Like, I don't know where that number comes from. But if I was in a government policy shop working, advising a senior decision maker, I'd be going in and saying, oh, that number is really sketchy. And so there needs to be some credible verification, probably third-party verification. And that's another thing that miners could really help with, I think. So there's different roles that are possible, and just being accessible for policy people, having people visit the mining sites, sort of really understanding what goes on. That's also very beneficial sometimes. So there's a lot of different things that can be done depending on the level of engagement that a company wants to take.
How do you see you cited it a couple times when we were first starting off, but how do you see curtailment programs and selling power back to the grid affecting these types of narratives? Because personally, I operate a 40 megawatt site, so we're curtailed, I'd say, at least 15% of the time, where we're not mining, we're selling our power back to the grid, and we're coming into a place where this power was being generated but not being used. So how do you see that playing an effect in the policy?
That's like getting into demand response programs and flexible loads and all that. It's more complex to describe that or to communicate that with people sometimes, but I think that's part of the education program that's really needed. We did sort of a very informal canvas at Satoshi Action. I think it was about 1.5 years ago, for the miners in the US, and sort of a voluntary thing on how much they'd curtailed. But we didn't do that one at a rigorous enough level that it could be used for evidence in a paper, which is looking in hindsight, it's unfortunate. We should have spent some more time designing this thing properly. I mean, it's a very important thing when we're talking economics of Bitcoin mining, supply and demand, and how the interaction between the grid and other electricity users in Bitcoin mines. It's something that gets fairly complicated. We've tried to write we have a couple of working papers out that were done through Satoshi Action. We had one that was it was actually goes back to Nick Carter and Sean Connell. They had done some work that was back before Nick went sort of on quantum FUD and different things. That they had a working paper, so we tried to I tried to, as an academic, somebody previously in academics, I tried to get that one up. We also had Brad Jones, who was the former chair of ERCOT, was a co-author on it, so that was just awesome. But then he got sick and he actually passed away by the time the paper was finished. We tried to explain as clearly as we could demand response and some of these issues about curtailment and what happens when, how, if you look at ERCOT, the strike prices, how they sort of as you come down, you basically watch the entire load shed, when the residential electricity demands really went up. So I think that can be done. I think a lot of people within government probably understand that better now than they did a couple of years ago. There's also, I mean, demand response is not just a Bitcoin mining thing either. It's also other industries. So there's a fairly broad understanding, but it's a complicated thing. And then the other thing that we don't really have access to in the research world is power purchasing agreements. So if we could get access to PPAs, and I understand that's normally really super confidential, but there's such variation in them. It's really hard to understand what goes on in the industry without understanding what those agreements look like. And
I'd be curious on how you guys could get more access to things like that, because I know when people are looking to host miners, at least at a large scale, I mean, you're not putting in 5 megawatts of your own personal miners if you don't have eyes on those PPAs. So maybe going to some of these larger hosting, or not hosting sites, but hosting players that are putting their miners, racking them somewhere, it might be kind of interesting for sure.
Yeah, it could be really valuable. And even when we did that methane, the methane modeling paper for the landfill, we even though the nodal guys were co-authors in the paper, we didn't I didn't see their their agreement. We just talked about, in the academic paper, we just talked about the business structure, so how that business structure between the miners and the landfill operators works out. There's a lot of different options in there, and it will really have an impact both on the cost of production for electricity potentially, and the way that the revenues are divvied up. So in the
100%.
model, we ended up going and building in a lot of uncertainty into the model, and we ran like 10,000 simulations, drawing like different parameters from different parts of the the electricity cost and different factors that affected mining.
Man, this is a little bit off track from where we've been, but I want to go more in depth real quick. We don't want to take up too much of your time. We're getting close on the hour mark, but can you explain the Bitcoin distillery and the project that your focus is currently on, and maybe go a little bit more in depth there?
Yeah, it's sort of a side. It started as a side project for me. I retired a few years. Well, I quit academics, and then I sort of decided I was retired, and so one of my areas, like I mentioned, is horizon scanning. So what are the new research questions, and what are the information gaps that need to be filled? And I view this as education service almost for academics. Like, okay, here's what goes on in Bitcoin. Here are the macro, the macroeconomic and the geopolitical, and also the mining information gaps that if they filled up, that's going to give policymakers and corporate decision makers a lot better information about what goes on in the space. So what I've been doing on the blog post about the distillery is to post a lot of briefing notes. I used to do briefing notes all the time. I worked for government for a little while. And so I watch YouTube videos, or well, actually, I don't watch them anymore. I use AI to summarize them. I've got most of it automated. I sit down and I'll listen to pods that really sound interesting, but I just don't have enough time to there's I don't know. I had 2,300 podcasts that from last year that I summarized. So I do a briefing note for each one, and what are the threats and the opportunities, and then from there, what are the potential, the candidate information gaps or research questions that need to be answered? Then I go through and prioritize. Then I go through and synthesize the whole works of them. And we did a mining specific exercise with a bunch of active miners a few years ago in 2023. That was published. So that's what I do, and the reason I'm doing that is to try to get to the synthesis section. So I have some outputs that are coming that really go out and are oriented at academics, and they're saying, look, this is a list of 100 questions that are really important. And all this information comes from the Bitcoin podcast space. So it's not that these are people that generally understand what's going on. And then with all the filtering and the synthesis put it into neutral language, so I'm not ranting about anything. And then highlighting what needs to happen. So this past year, I just finished one. I just posted just a couple of days ago the 2025 summary, and I had 14 questions in there about Bitcoin mining. So there were some of the things that were sort of financially related, like is there rehypothecation? What happens with equipment that might be pledged in numerous spots? And then there's some more policy oriented. There's some sort of geopolitical implications. But in general, I think my feeling is that we've gone from, a few years ago doing this, the impacts we were concerned with. Well, what are the environmental impacts of such and such type of mining? And what really seems to be happening, the level of sophistication of the discussion, of the discourse has really gone up over the years. And so we're really looking at, how does Bitcoin mining, how does it factor into, what's its role as industrial production? What's its role in energy production now, especially with AI demands and the competition potentially? And then what's its role in community and regional development? So we're sort of getting away from the really simple questions, and we're in the syntheses. We're starting to get up and see these higher order impacts, and people are starting to become interested in what higher impacts or the higher order impacts of mining are. And I think that if we can get this type of thing out into the environment, into the academic environment, it will maybe help to stimulate some research in the area. I've had a number of master's level students that have been interested in Bitcoin projects at school that have gotten a hold, and they've used some of the questions directly. And I've done a lot of this with ecotoxicologists in the past, and a lot on ocean science and fisheries. So it's a technique that works fairly well, but it takes a bit of time to take hold. So what I'm doing in the distillery, a lot of it's just really my personal research background that I'm just posting on online right now. And I hope that I'll be doing a few more things in the future that will be more specific for the really important questions. I would love to see, actually, some companies or somebody else, donors of some sort, step in to be able to fund working groups that really they put together academics and industry people and policymakers in one room or in one team, and then go through and try to answer some of these questions. So we aren't just always asking them, we're actually answering them.
Just to clarify, when you're talking about distilleries, you're talking about like the creating alcohol, correct?
Yeah.
Like, okay, so we not us personally. So this is our set. We just took over the Build a Mine podcast from the previous host, Trevor, right? So he actually interviewed somebody about a year ago now that is running about 0.5 megawatt off of some of the excess waste from making bourbon out in Kentucky, and they're mining off of those renewables. That's something I don't know if you're familiar with at all, but it was a really interesting project. So once I saw that you were doing, or at least researching the field itself, I was really curious to see how it really plays out.
Oh yeah, and it's not like the distillery from an alcohol perspective, like for me, but like it was distilling information down. But that's fascinating. And just in my background here, this is the plug. There's a North Vancouver, made in Vancouver, British Columbia, my Hoddle strong beer.
Awesome. That's awesome.
I don't know if that focused properly, but yeah, that was pretty cool. So there's a company over in North Vancouver that's using, I don't know, they're using waste heat somehow on the operation.
I just saw on X, they have somebody just put on a water heater that mines Bitcoin. And I saw that and I was like, I just literally replaced my water heater about 3 months ago. Of course, right? Like Murphy's Law, weeks after the water heater blows, like the warranty ends, like within a week, my water heater goes. And then they had to bring in multiple ones because all of them were junk. And I saw that. I'm like, had I known this, I would have been the first person to order that, because what a great way to reuse heat and mine Bitcoin.
That's my biggest fears. So the proof of heat space is super interesting to me. I just bought a house, especially now being a homeowner with a 20-year-old water tank. That is very interesting to me. But being a Bitcoin mining operator for the last 5 years, I know how much these things break. So I mean, if I'm putting a hydro unit in I'm spending like $5-6 grand on my water heater when I could go buy one for $600. Yeah, I'm offsetting the cost, but I'm curious on like what some of these builds are like and what their dead on arrival is, because I know when I order 1,000 units, at least 50 of those I've got to flash them. So I'm curious to see how that plays out. Thing.
From a company perspective, the economics are, if you're shipping, I mean, aside from Bitcoin mining, which seems, DOA seems to be a more acceptable, what we'll call it like a feature, right? Not a bug, to quote Sailor. But, because I've sold products, if you've got a lot of returns and a lot of broken products, like there's a very, very strong economic incentive to have things show up that actually work. So I'll put it that way. It's very important.
Yeah, it's a fascinating space to see the home mining products coming up. The air heaters, now the water heaters. I saw that post as well. And I mean, there are mines that are using generating waste heat for there's a name in Europe they use for them, but it's like the district heating idea, that you're heating like I think it's thousands of houses in some areas already. So as we move forward, there's a lot of waste heat that's generated all the way around, and I mean it certainly helps out for the economics. On a landfill site, it would help out. If you had a landfill that was in a fairly urban area and there was other industrial uses in the local area.
I live a mile down the street from a landfill, like a mile and a half. In my backyard. And every time I drive by it to go to work, to my office here, I'm like, maybe I should set up a container, Just
Yeah.
get that written.
Yeah. Well, for the landfills, I mean, there are some of them that already do district heating, and I mean, there's a lot that generate electricity and sell to industrial users generally. So you get into the mix then, and then you know you need to, from a business perspective, you have to be thinking, okay, what's the mix in here? Like, what are the risk and the profit potential for or cost recovery potential for putting in miners versus some other sort of industrial use. So from a landfill operator perspective, I could see that there would be, you know, some hesitation probably on that until it was actually demonstrated. I've always thought that it would be really interesting to have a nonprofit that facilitated Bitcoin mining at landfills, because I just don't see the economics being such that, you know, a commercial miner is going to be able to go in and make money at a landfill. Now, that might be there's a couple of like caveats with that. One is like maybe for large landfills where there's economies of scale and you can cut your electricity generation costs. Maybe that's the case. But if it's going to cost you 5.5 cents per kilowatt hour to produce electricity, well, that's better than plugging in your miners into the grid. But that might not be enough for really making for a profitable commercial operation.
For sure.
Okay, last question here before we wrap up. What are some other renewable opportunities for Bitcoin mining that you think are underdeveloped?
Well, like actually, for internationally, the landfill space is extremely underdeveloped. So, like I've seen numbers, and I think we mentioned this in the landfill paper. Like Africa, urban landfills in Africa emit a huge amount of methane into the atmosphere, and and again, numbers are I'm doing off the top of my head. They might not be quite right, but it's something like basically urban landfills in Africa power roughly about 70% of the Bitcoin network right now. You know, and that's never mind China or India or anywhere else. So just in landfills, there's tremendous opportunity for expansion. And then agriculture and food processing also extremely potentially profitable. And or not, maybe not profitable, but like high potential for use. And then I'm Canadian, so I love like the hydropower developments as well. And there's lots of opportunity, I think, for international hydropower development still. And that's not even, you know, not even getting into small modular nuclear or, you know, whatever happens, like beaming down electricity or data centers in space, some of the new ideas that are being thrown around now.
Everything is cooler in space, especially data centers and Bitcoin mining. So, Murray, thank you so much. That's been really, really interesting, and it's been awesome having you on. I want to make sure everybody hits us on, again, our Telegram groups. So we're going to flash those here, but we will also have them in the description. You definitely want to get in on that if you want to learn more about Bitcoin mining, because we have so many wonderful groups covering so many different topics and niches within the space. That being said, thank you, guys. It's been great. And
Awesome.
We will see you next week. Or
Thanks.
Not next week, but soon.
Thanks so much.
We'll see you guys.